The China-Vietnam War, 1979. In 1975, the world watched as Vietnam emerged victorious from a brutal conflict with the United States. The country was war-weary but determined, and it quickly began to rebuild and assert its influence across Southeast Asia. But Vietnam's rise was not without its challenges. While it had triumphed in its war for independence, it now found itself navigating a complex and treacherous political landscape. One of the biggest challenges, its uneasy relationship with its giant neighbor to the north, China. To understand the tensions that led to the China-Vietnam War of 1979, we need to take a step back and look at the broader context. The relationship between China and the Soviet Union had been deteriorating for years. What started as a camaraderie between communist giants turned into a bitter rivalry, a split that would have serious repercussions for the entire region. By the late 1970s, Vietnam had aligned itself with the Soviet Union, further straining its relationship with China. This alignment wasn't just ideological, it was strategic. Vietnam was looking for powerful allies as it dealt with ongoing border disputes with China and as it expanded its influence in Cambodia, a move that Beijing viewed as a direct challenge. The border disputes between China and Vietnam had been simmering for years. Tensions escalated as Vietnam's military intervention in Cambodia effectively toppled the Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge regime. To China, this was an unacceptable affront to its authority in the region, and it set the stage for a confrontation that seemed almost inevitable. By early 1979, the stage was set. Diplomatic efforts had failed, and both nations were preparing for what would become a brief but bloody war. The question was no longer if they would clash, but when. In February 1979, the tension reached its breaking point. China, determined to teach Vietnam a lesson, launched a full-scale invasion. But as the conflict unfolded, both sides would quickly learn that war is never as simple as planned. On February 17, 1979, the long-brewing tension between China and Vietnam exploded into open conflict. In a move that surprised many, China launched a full-scale invasion across Vietnam's northern border. The stated goal: to teach Vietnam a lesson for its actions in Cambodia. But beneath the surface, China had much more on its mind. The Chinese offensive was swift and brutal. Over 200,000 troops poured across the border, attacking Vietnamese positions along a nearly 600-mile front. Their target, the strategic cities of Lang Son, Cao Binh, and Lao Tsai. China's leadership believed that a quick and decisive strike would force Vietnam to reconsider its regional ambitions. But Vietnam was no stranger to invasion. After all, this was the same country that had outlasted the French and the Americans in grueling conflicts. Vietnamese forces, though smaller in number, were battle-hardened and highly motivated to defend their territory. They knew their terrain well and used it to their advantage, setting up ambushes in the dense jungle and mountainous regions. The initial clashes were fierce. Both sides suffered heavy casualties as they fought for control of key towns and villages. Chinese forces relied on overwhelming numbers and artillery barrages, while the Vietnamese used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and then disappearing into the rugged landscape. It was a classic David versus Goliath scenario, with Vietnam once again playing the underdog. The human cost of the war quickly became apparent. Villages were destroyed, thousands were killed or wounded, and civilians fled the combat zones in droves. Despite the devastation, the war remained largely confined to the border areas as neither side wanted to risk a broader conflict. As the war dragged on, both China and Vietnam found themselves in a grueling and costly stalemate. What had started as a quick punitive expedition was turning into a war of attrition. The question on everyone's mind: how long could this continue before one side would break? As the days turned into weeks, the China-Vietnam War of 1979 escalated into a series of brutal and bloody battles. Both sides were determined to achieve their objectives, but the terrain and the tenacity of the Vietnamese defenders made every inch of ground fiercely contested. One of the most significant battles took place in Lang Son, a key town just 15 miles from the Chinese border. Capturing Lang Son was crucial for the Chinese forces, as it would open the way to Hanoi and deliver a psychological blow to the Vietnamese. But the Vietnamese knew this too, and they were prepared to defend the town at all costs. The Battle of Lang Son was a test of wills. Chinese troops launched wave after wave of assaults, using overwhelming firepower and sheer numbers to try and break the Vietnamese defenses. But the Vietnamese, well versed in the art of asymmetric warfare, used every trick in the book to hold their ground. From booby traps to surprise ambushes, the defenders turned Lang Son into a nightmare for the invaders. Both sides employed different strategies to try and gain the upper hand. The Chinese relied on their traditional human wave tactics, sending large numbers of troops into the fray in the hopes of overwhelming the enemy. On the other hand, the Vietnamese, vastly outnumbered, focused on hit-and-run tactics, exploiting their intimate knowledge of the local terrain to outmaneuver the Chinese forces. The battle raged for days, with heavy casualties on both sides. In the end, Lang Son fell to the Chinese, but the victory came at a tremendous cost. The fierce resistance they encountered there foreshadowed the difficulties they would face in trying to achieve a quick and decisive victory. What was supposed to be a swift punitive expedition was turning into a protracted and costly campaign. With both sides dug in and neither willing to back down, the war entered a new phase of grueling stalemate where every victory was Pyrrhic, and the cost of continuing the conflict began to outweigh any potential gains. As the world watched, the question remained, who would blink first? By early March 1979, the war that China had anticipated would be a swift punitive strike had ground to a halt. The fierce resistance put up by the Vietnamese had slowed the Chinese advance to a crawl, and the conflict settled into a bloody stalemate. Both nations found themselves locked in a war that neither had truly wanted to prolong. Despite initial gains, the Chinese forces were unable to deliver the decisive blow they had hoped for. The rugged terrain, combined with the Vietnamese's guerrilla tactics, made every advance a costly one. For China, the question was no longer about teaching Vietnam a lesson, it was about how to extricate themselves from a war that was becoming increasingly unwinnable. On the diplomatic front, both sides began to consider their options. China, aware that a prolonged conflict could drain its resources and potentially escalate into a broader regional war, started to signal its willingness to negotiate. Meanwhile, Vietnam, having held off the initial onslaught, was also facing the reality of continued fighting, something that could further devastate its already war-weary population. The stalemate on the ground mirrored the deadlock at the negotiating table. Both sides fortified their positions, and sporadic skirmishes continued, but neither was able to deliver a knockout punch. It was a war of attrition, with high casualties but little strategic gain. For many soldiers, it was a grueling test of endurance rather than a battle for victory. The international community watched with growing concern as the conflict dragged on. While the war was largely contained within the border regions, its implications were far-reaching. The conflict strained China's relationships with other nations, particularly the Soviet Union, and added another layer of complexity to the already volatile geopolitics of Southeast Asia. Finally, in mid-March 1979, after 3 weeks of intense fighting, China announced that it would begin withdrawing its forces. The decision was framed as a declaration of victory acclaim that was met with skepticism, especially given the heavy losses and limited territorial gains. Nevertheless, the withdrawal marked the end of active hostilities, though the scars of the war would linger for years to come. While the guns fell silent, the legacy of the China-Vietnam War of 1979 was far from over. The conflict had reshaped the political landscape of Southeast Asia and left both nations to grapple with the consequences. As the dust settled, one thing was clear: the war had redefined not just the border, but the balance of power in the region. As time marched on, the immediate wounds of the China-Vietnam War of 1979 began to heal. But the conflict left behind a legacy that continues to shape the region's political and social landscape even today. The war, though short-lived, had far-reaching consequences that went beyond the battlefield. In Vietnam, the war reinforced the narrative of resilience and independence that has defined the nation for centuries. The country's ability to stand up to a much larger power was a source of national pride, but it also came at a heavy cost. The loss of life, the destruction of infrastructure, and the economic strain added yet another chapter to Vietnam's long history of struggle and perseverance. Economically, the war delayed Vietnam's development, as resources that could have been used for growth were instead diverted to defense. However, in the long run, Vietnam emerged stronger, eventually opening up its economy and becoming a key player in Southeast Asia. On the other hand, China, despite its initial military success, faced the reality that its intervention had strained relations with its neighbors and complicated its diplomatic standing in the region. By the 1990s, both nations recognized the need to move past the conflict. The normalization of relations was gradual but inevitable, driven by mutual economic interests and the desire for stability in the region. The war, once a point of bitter contention, became a distant memory as both countries looked towards a future of cooperation rather than conflict. Academically, the China-Vietnam War of 1979 is studied as a significant, though often overlooked, conflict in Cold War history. It highlighted the complexities of Sino-Soviet relations, the resilience of smaller nations in the face of larger powers, and the unpredictable nature of military engagements. The lessons learned from this war continue to inform military strategy and diplomatic policy in the region. Today, the legacy of the China-Vietnam War is reflected in the careful diplomacy that governs Southeast Asia, while the scars of the past remain. Both nations have managed to forge a path forward, balancing the memories of conflict with the realities of a globalized world. The war may have ended, but its impact on the region's political landscape is still felt, proving that history, even when it seems distant, never truly fades away. The China-Vietnam War of 1979 was a brief but pivotal moment in history, a conflict that reshaped a region, tested the resolve of nations, and left behind a legacy that continues to influence the world today.